Welcome, everyone. This afternoon's session is on electric vehicle charging stations. I'm Tony Giaventu, the Executive Director of CHOA. I'll be the speaker to talk about Strata Corporation function under the Strata Property Act, your bylaws, your procedures that you follow. Rob McGregor from Electrum Charging Solutions is joining us along with some of his team, and they're going to talk about more of the real world of what's actually happening with stations, how you get them installed. They'll talk about some of the grant options and some of the other issues that come up. Our sponsor this week is Power Strata Systems, and they manage basically database and corporate history for Strata corporations online. It's a great service. It's a great system. I use it frequently as it gives us direct access to historic records of Strata corporations, which are absolutely essential. If nothing else, it's one of the best services just for that alone, to store your records and documents. Just a few little notes. If you have a question, please put it into the Q&A. Daryl from our office is going to be hovering around in the background, and he's going to be reviewing questions, and so we can spend our time on the presentation, but when we get to the Q&A at the end, it will give us an opportunity to come back and look at the questions. Please, if you have a question that didn't get answered, please email me. We'll do our best to find an answer for you. My email and Rob's email were at the very beginning. I'll go back to that slide again at the end so you have those email addresses. If you have a question, don't identify personal information. We see your names through the registration list, and that'll be the extent of it. But beyond that, don't identify your strata or anything else. Just remember also that this is not legal advice. It's going to be fairly generic because there are so many variations from strata corporation to strata corporation. It's impossible to give specific answers without looking at all of your records and documents. So without any further ado, I'm just going to jump right in. There are two options, and this all comes down to an owner who is wanting to purchase an electric vehicle, or ironically, in a number of circumstances, they've already purchased a vehicle without finding out whether it's even possible to put in a charging station in their building, or whether the Strata Corporation will permit it, which we discourage greatly because it's not always a guaranteed option. But there are two options if you're going to consider doing it. The first option, and it's by no means a priority, but this is where you look at the possibility of building electrification. And what this means is your parking garage gets modified with a simple electrical grid. So there's very easy access to electrical connections to be able to install stations at most or multiple parking spaces throughout your parking garage. It is the best option because it's the most cost effective. It's a long-term effect. You're not dealing with constant alterations or invasion into your electrical systems. It's one solution that will treat everyone fairly with the same access, which also is a benefit. You won't have any he said, she said, or benefits of cost for one or the other. It generally requires a three-quarters vote for approval to electrify, because it is likely in every circumstance a significant change in use or appearance, the installation and the cost that's associated with it. There are some limited grants available through local governments and through the province for building electrification. So this is just the parking garage. This is the ideal option. And the benefit of this is it pretty much means you don't have to go through the hoops again of somebody making an application. You set up the conditions the first time for the installation of the system. You've gone through an evaluation of your electrical system. The Strata's approved the building electrification, and then subsequent stations are all installed on the basic same terms and conditions. If that's not possible and your Strata Corporation is not prepared to approve that or move forward, you still have the other option, which is individual agreements and permission for installation and alteration to the common electrical systems. And so that means each individual person comes to the Strata Corporation with a request and an application under the bylaws. The problem with this is it's a bit of a short-term solution, because you will eventually have other parties who come forward, and they're also looking for the installation. And if this means that each one of these installations is a separate conduit running from the electrical service to their parking space, it's much more costly. It's much more invasive to the building's electrical systems, and it isn't a long-term solution for anyone. It will likely require a 3/4 vote if it's a significant change in use or appearance of your property. It may not. It may be just the matter of an installation of an electrical conduit that does not alter the property. Your parking spaces could be limited common property, in which case there's no choice. Owners would have to use these spaces anyhow. And then for individual agreements for installation, there are a number of grants available through the province, through local governments, through BC Hydro, on different levels for different varying projects. So this is where the applicants would look at this here before they proceed. It's the things you need to know before you get to the alteration. These are the critical things. And I think the most important issue you need to know is, how is the property designated? You need to look at your bylaws. You need to see who is conducting the alteration, if it needs any type of building or electrical permits. Does it constitute a significant change in the use of property? Would it result in any impact to the use enjoyment of any other strata lot owner or their parking spaces? Are there conditions that can be imposed by the strata prior to granting permission? And if the applicant is going to be responsible for the cost of the alteration. So I'm just going to go through those quickly, because I think that these are essential steps that often get missed. So property designations are probably the most important consideration when you review any alteration application. So electric vehicle charging stations are no different. If it's common property under the standard bylaws that you're dealing with for parking, then the Strata Corporation has several options. One of the options is to simply deny the installation. They could say, no, we're not going to permit them. Another option is to permit it, but impose a very long list of conditions and standards. That's another option. If it's limited common property, is also common property. So the same conditions would apply for both common and limited common property. A benefit of common property, if the parking spaces are not designated, is that parking spaces can be reallocated and moved. So you could essentially end up with a series of charging stations adjacent to your electrical facility. This will greatly reduce cost, transmission, makes it more affordable for these types of alterations. If it's limited common property, the strata cannot move the individuals from their parking spaces without either a unanimous vote, if it was created by the owner developer as limited common property, or a 3/4 vote if the limited common property was created by the Strata Corporation. So it's important that you know the property designations before anything else happens. And what does this mean? It means you need a printed copy of your registered strata plan. Desktop is fine, printed copy is fine, but clearly you need to understand and identify how all these parking spaces have been created and how all these parking spaces are designated, if any. You should have this information anyhow, as it directly affects any information on parking and storage lockers that you disclose on a Form B information certificate. So this should be readily available information, but that's your starting point. What's our property designation? Then you have to look at your bylaws. So what is permitted under your bylaws? Standard bylaws for change or alteration of a strata lot are, an owner may do so and the strata can't be unreasonable about it, which essentially means you really can't say no. But we have very, very few parking spaces which are actually part of strata lots, unless they are on a bareland strata within a townhouse complex and part of the strata lot, or specifically designated as part of a strata lot. Again, this is where you need to look at your strata plan. The bylaws also give you designations and relationships. What are we required or what are we permitted to do? And this is where common or limited common property for the charging stations is incredibly beneficial for strata corporations, because under the standard bylaws and most bylaws of corporations, you're allowed to impose conditions in exchange for permission. As a condition of granting permission, we require all of the following conditions be met. And we'll look at a bunch of those in a moment. Common property and general use. So these are all areas on the strata plan that are not listed as a strata lot, limited common property, or common property. If they're not identified, they automatically, under the Act, default to common property. Most parking areas in most strata corporations are either common property or limited common property. Townhouses, and I'm going to speak to those specifically, townhouses specifically, you have to look closely. It's about a 50-50 split between those where the parking space inside the garage, which is part of the unit, are often either common property or limited common property, or maybe part of the strata lot. They're generally not part of the strata lot, however, because they're not deemed to be habitable living space. So you have to apply the correct bylaw to the correct designation. And it's easier in a townhouse complex because often you're working with meter and the panel of the individual townhouse unit itself, which has very little, if no effect on the strata corporation. It would have no impact on a 3/4 vote for significant change in use or appearance. It would have no impact on a rule for consumption or metering, as everything would be direct metered through the panel that would be accessed. So townhouse strata corporations, very specifically, when you have a unit, a parking garage connected to a unit, you have to look at what the designations are. The other issue is that under common property, and remember this, it's very important, but under common property, a strata corporation is not permitted to make an owner responsible for maintenance and repair of common property. The maintenance and repair of the common property itself is the responsibility of the strata corporation. If it's limited common property, however, which is where you're wanting to look, as limited common property, you can make an owner responsible for the cost related to the maintenance and repair as well as the common property. So again, the designation, I think this is often overlooked by everyone. It's really critical that you understand clearly the designation. Again, common property, limited common property is common property. It's just designated for exclusive use, and you can amend your bylaws to make owners more responsible for limited common property. And again, we always look at common property. Limited common property is balconies, decks, parking spaces, storage lockers, those things that can affect it. But remember, with limited common property, you can amend it to the definition to define obligations of owners with respects to maintenance and repair. So it's a nuance, but it's a nuance that can be incredibly effective for use. So here's a good example of a townhouse garage who wants to install a charging station, and the townhouse unit itself is limited common property. Do they need permission to install a charging station? And the answer is yes, whether it's common or limited common property. There may be absolutely minimal obligation or connection here for the strata to really be involved in. You may not have any user fee, as it would be directly connected to a panel. The alteration is entirely within the unit, but remember that that common or limited common property area, as well as the strata lot, is still an insurable interest of the strata corporation. You still, as a strata, have an obligation to maintain insurance on it. This alteration could have an effect on that. So you're going to be looking at things like usual custodial maintenance under the standard bylaws, which for limited common property is things like sweeping, cleaning, or clearing of snow. But you can superimpose or amend the bylaw to add more: the obligation to maintain, repair, and insure the charging station, the obligation for any costs associated with the charging station. All of those can be added as conditions as you move forward with the alteration. Boundaries of a strata lot, just to be perfectly clear, that a parking garage in townhouses that is limited common property is not part of the strata lot. It is common property that is designated as limited common property for the exclusive use of that owner, but it is still essentially common property. So don't get them confused. Most people say, well, I have my own garage, my own parking space as part of my strata lot. Yes, you do, but it's not part of your strata lot. It's still common property. And remember, on the test of do we grant permission or not with townhouses, the strata can't unreasonably refuse. So let's look at a conventional application for a common property parking space. An owner comes to you, they're purchasing, or they have already purchased an electric vehicle. They want to install a charging station in their designated parking space. So the strata corporation looks at the bylaws. And again, you're only dealing with an owner, not a tenant. If the tenant is in the building, even if they're a commercial tenant and they wish to make this application, make sure you get the written permission and the direction from the owner of the strata lot before you start this process. So you're going to enter into the agreement with the registered owner, because if the unit sells, you're going to want the subsequent owners to be compelled to also maintain the same binding relationship as you go forward. But so we've got an owner comes forward, they want to make an application to put in a charging station. What do we need? First, we need documents. We need a copy of the strata plan. We need to know the designation. We need to look at the bylaws, and we need to know the technical details of the installation. Those are three basic things that you're going to need to get started as a strata council. What information do you need is even more essential now. We've decided, yes, it's possible, but do we have sufficient electrical capacity? I would hazard a guess that every building probably has capacity for at least 1, 2, or 3 stations. The difficulty is with our aging buildings and our limited energy systems that they were installed with, that might be the limit without an upgrade. An electrical capacity study is recommended for buildings. It certainly will identify any electrical deficiencies in your building, and it will give you the opportunity to understand what type of upgrades are available. And it will make it very well known of how many stations you could potentially install. If you're doing things like an LED upgrade in your building at the same time, which is a phenomenal cost savings, if you're doing that at the same time, an LED upgrade will free a substantial amount of electrical capacity in your building, and may actually make a number of charging stations available without the need for upgrades. You'll need to know who's performing the installation. Is it a service provider who can be relied upon? Are they insured? What your real goal is as the Strata Corporation is, how are we acting in the best interest of the corporation here? But at the same time, how are we facilitating the installation of a charging station? And then you're going to want to, after you've been through your review, you're going to want to adopt either a rule or a bylaw relating to the use and the consumption rates. The regulations were amended a few years ago. Rules can be used for user fees. And rules are nice because rates can be changed easily by amending the rule without having to refile a new bylaw amendment in the land title registry. So if the rules passed by majority vote at council, you set a rate, an agreed upon rate, and the electrical consumption, and Rob will touch on this a bit when we get into it, but the electrical consumption itself is very closely and accurately monitored through the stations. So you can actually just set a rate per kilowatt hour, and that can easily be monitored off of a desktop app for monthly rates and for billing. You can set the rate, it becomes part of the rule, it becomes part of the agreement with the owner. Or you can, rather than setting a rate, you can just set a monthly rate if you have a reasonable estimate, and it removes all of that problem. Just remember, user fees cannot be collected or charged until your rule is ratified at a general meeting. So council can pass the rule, you can get into the agreement, but you can't charge that or start charging that until that rule has been approved by majority vote at a general meeting of the owners. Just a little part in the step of the process. Rules are nice because they're easily modified and changed by a majority vote. Does every alteration need a permit? Oftentimes they're cosmetic, but you may find, depending on your municipality or the region you're dealing with, you will probably require an electrical permit for the installation of the station. And it's not the station, moreover, the alteration to your electrical service for the installation of the station. So, like all alterations, we look for things like changes in plumbing systems, electrical services, structures of buildings, fire safety systems, ventilation. Many of these things require permits to ensure that there is a minimal compliance standard. How do we know if an alteration is significant in use or appearance? I think it's pretty obvious. I think if it's going to change the appearance of a building, if it's going to change access or use of a building, if it's going to change the structure of a building, those would all be flags that it's probably going to be a significant change. Somebody wants to enclose a balcony, install a skylight, they're painting their unit a different color, or the installation of the charging station requires moving a parking space, or requires a significant electrical upgrade to the building. that's going to be a significant change in use or appearance. And you can probably rely on the fact that it's safer to simply get a 3/4 vote for the change than not. So here's a list of the critical questions before you grant permission. And these apply really to almost every type of alteration. Who's going to conduct the work? More and more, we are experiencing strata corporations who are raising flags and problems because uncertified, unlicensed, uninsured contractors are doing work in the buildings. The insurance industry is raising flags on this. When an unqualified, uninsured contractor does work in the building and there's a loss, your insurance provider has no one to go after because this person has caused the loss. It's a significant problem. Whoever you're using, make sure that the parties are qualified, they're insured, insist on copies of the insurance. Will this affect the appearance of the building? Generally, EVSEs don't, but they do add a significant amount of value to the building. We've certainly seen that when it comes to changes in modernization of buildings as they've been upgraded. Will the charging station affect any other owner? This, like anything else, is something you have to take into consideration. Unless it has blocked or obstructed someone else, it's unlikely that's the effect, but it's important to ask the question. Who's going to be responsible for cost of maintenance and repairs of the enclosure, the parking stall, the installed skylight, whatever it is, who's responsible for it? Cost is something you can impose as part of the agreement. Make sure you have written agreements with everything clearly articulated, including who's going to pay for the costs. And the costs are not only going to include things like maintenance and repair, but who's paying for the cost if there's additional insurance? Who's paying for a cost if there's a loss? What happens if the owner sells? This is, I think this is kind of like the $1 million question. John has sold his unit. He has a charging station. The new owner coming in has an electric car. The new owner is not bound to that agreement unless John in his sales agreement gets the new owner to agree to this. And these are some of the terms and conditions you want to put into your agreements. This is called an assumption agreement. There needs to be a compelling requirement that the seller is required to get the buyer to enter into an assumption agreement to assume this agreement for use for the charging station. Will this alteration affect any other areas? The impact of that question is really more over if we allow for 1, 2, or 3 stations and we haven't done electrical upgrades, what happens with everybody who comes after them? Are we just simply at the point that we can't permit anymore? Or are there other options available? This is more about the future effect rather than a physical effect that we're dealing with. Is an electrical permit required? So an electrical permit would be local government, and again, part of the conditions of what you're dealing with. Just remember when you're dealing with on who pays. As a condition of granting permission, the strata can always impose conditions. They can require an owner to pay for all current and future costs, the alteration, any legal services, engineering services, anything associated with this upgrade is something that the strata can make as a condition of permission to do this. But be reasonable about it. If you're actually trying to get the building electrified on the shoulders of an owner and get them to pay for the engineering study for the corporation, that may not be a reasonable expectation. You know, when you look at this closely, when the owner is given permission to alter the strata lot or the common property or the limited common property, and they're required under the bylaws to maintain and repair the charging station, it includes everything: alterations, benefits, improvements, any policy upgrades, requirements, or anything else associated with it. Here's the things you can expect an applicant owner to cover: any permitting or engineering, any additional insurance. A part of the agreement, we will have, as the Strata Council, we'll have our lawyer draw up the user agreement along with the alteration agreement. You'll be responsible for that cost. You'll be responsible for cost for construction, any waste management and removal, environmental costs, and you'll be responsible for any damages caused by this permitted alteration. If you've planned this well, a good time to plan or to look to your owners to see if anybody wants to do this is about 6 months before your AGM, because what this gives you is time, if somebody does want to do this, to be able to plan for a rule that can get ratified at your AGM. It gives you time to plan for any economic options that you may want. If you're thinking of having your building parking garage electrified for the ease of installation, gives you time to look at the costs, to do a electrical capacity study, gives you time to be able to look at the other options that are available so the owners can vote on this at an AGM. So, start your planning process about 6 months before, and this will give you a nice window to be able to look at these options. Few unusual conditions to watch for, and we do this with all alteration seminars. If you have a strata corporation that has multiple sections that relate to residential and non-residential lots, they can have varied interests and uses. So you need to look both at the bylaws of the section as well as the bylaws of the corporation. And then, of course, we have the phenomena of airspace parcels or multiple strata corporations sharing the same parking facilities. There may be easements permitting your strata corporation to have parking in the underground parking garage with either an airspace parcel or multiple strata corporations, but you may not own that parking. It may not be common property of the corporation. It may just be an easement, and you might not have the right to grant permission for charging stations. There are many of these across the province now, and each and every one of them have slightly different nuances to them. When you look at them closely, in some cases, the strata corporation itself, let's say I was making an application to my strata, but we don't own the parking. My strata doesn't have the authority to grant that permission. We have to go to the strata corporation where that parking has been allocated on their strata plan to see what the options are. So if you have multiple strata corporations or airspace parcels sharing a parking garage, it's in everyone's interest to look at a joint option of how to electrify those spaces with respect to the installation of charging station. Here are 3 questions that I think they're the most common questions that we get. So the owner has an alteration agreement with the strata that they will pay for costs relating to the charging station. Does this obligation transfer to a new owner? Not unless the obligation has been put into some sort of assumption agreement between the seller and the buyer. And that's an important thing to know in the alteration agreement. You need to include these types of terms within your agreements to ensure that that obligation will carry on to the next party, or at least oblige the next party to enter into an agreement. How do we encourage it to transfer to the new owners? It goes into the alteration agreement that you've done with the current owner, that you require them, if they sell their unit, to compel the next owner to be responsible or enter into the same agreement. Are we required to grant permission to alter the parking to install EVSEs? It depends on how the property is designated. I'd like to give you a black and white answer, but if it's generally common property, the answer is no. You are not obliged to do it. However, if you've done it once, you've now set a precedent and conditions of how you're going to do it for the future. And you're going to have to treat everyone else the same and fairly. So before you grant permission, have a look and make sure that you have an electrical capacity study done so that you're aware of what's going to come. So Rob, I think we're over to you now, and then we'll have time for some questions here. And you have to unmute yourself, Rob, because technology is going to get the best of you. There you go. There you go. Okay.
I think we're good. Thanks, Tony. That's a lot of great information. Thank you. So yes, so I'm Rod McGregor, and I'm with Electrum Charging Solutions, and I have my colleague with me, Neil McEachern, that is going to help me rattle through this slide presentation. So I'm going to turn this over right now. We'll do a little back and forthing here between Neil and I, but I'm going to turn this part over to Neil. So thanks, Neil. You want to take over?
Sure. Can everyone hear me all right?
Good, go.
Yep. Great. Yeah, so just this is a quick primer here. Long story short on this slide is EVs are coming and quickly, and you know, like it or not, probably if not your next car, definitely the one after will be electric. So there's a couple of things on the books there. One, in BC, we're talking, almost 10% of all new vehicles are currently electric, and that's as of 2020, and probably higher now in 2021. And by the time we get to 2035, the federal government has put a hard stop on the sale of non-zero emissions vehicles. So gasoline, diesel, natural gas vehicles, you will no longer be able to purchase new ones in Canada as of 2035. So it's really important to prepare for that now. If you get to the point where you're at 2035 and you're starting to do that process, it's going to be likely a lot more expensive if you haven't planned accordingly. So this is something we really try to communicate to people that we speak to and to our clients is the time to plan for this is now. And you're going to be able to get ahead of this problem and manage those costs a lot more reasonably. On the levels of charging, so there was a question there, I think in the chat window that said, hey, I've got an outlet by my parking space. Can I already use that? Yes, you can. That's level 1. So, if you look at that first band, you can get about, depending on your car, depending on the outlets, 4 to 10 kilometers per hour of charging. If you're just doing kind of light commutes and you're able to charge overnight regularly, that can definitely be made to work. There are some drawbacks to that when you start talking about new deployments. It's actually because of some of the details of how wiring has to be done under code, it's actually generally more expensive to install new level 1 infrastructure. But if you've got outlets that are already there, it definitely use what you've already got if it's going to meet your needs. If not, level 2 has a lot more flexibility and kind of hits that balance between, charging speed, the ability to manage energy intelligently and cost. And then level 3 is kind of these fast, interurban public chargers, and that gives you a lot more charging speed, so up to 35 kilometers of range per minute. But understandably, the costs of those in a residential setting are just going to be prohibitive. So level 2 generally makes the most sense.
If I could just throw in a comment there, Neil, for those that are not totally familiar with the amount of energy required to charge a vehicle, using level 1, using the existing 110/120 volt infrastructure, so basically a wall plug, and if it happens, you happen to have one in your garage, plugging in an electric vehicle is like plugging in a toaster. You can only get up to typically 13 amps of output out of a 110 volt outlet, which is about the maximum amount as a toaster. Because even though it's a vehicle that's plugged into it, there's only a certain amount that the breaker will allow to flow through that circuit. So the amount of electricity going to an electric car is very, very low. The other bad piece to this, it's really difficult to monitor how much electricity is actually being consumed during that charge process. Whereas with the level 2, those meters are connected to a back end or to a network that allows full monitoring of all electrical consumption to the point where there is back end software that allows the administrator to know exactly who is plugged into that charging station, not to mention how much electricity they've consumed. Just throw it back to you. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks, Rob. I guess, yeah, Rob wants to talk this one, so
Yeah, so in addition to, and this goes back to a comment that Tony made, we're finding that the modernization of buildings, the existing buildings, there is an assumption that's being made now. New buildings have to be built with EV infrastructure in place. At least the hard wiring needs to be in place in all new builds. So now that puts a bit of a strain on older buildings that do not have EV level 2, in particular, level 2 EV charging infrastructure. So we're finding that the values of older buildings are increasing if they have this infrastructure in place. So you need to consider that it's kind of an intangible, and it kind of tagged along at the end. Nobody saw this coming, but there is a definite effect of the value of an older building that now has EV charging in place. So it's something that does need to be considered, certainly when if somebody is coming to the Strata Council and wanting to put in EV charging, it's something that does definitely need to be conveyed. Oh, by the way, if we do this, we're actually modernizing our facility or building, and we're increasing the value of the property in the process. So now, if we look at what basically the process, and Tony touched on this earlier, that there's a couple of ways of going about this. You can do this on your own, and that I just mean by the strata, never mind a single owner. So you can do it on your own, or you can apply for a grant. Now, there are provincial grants available, and they just seem to keep coming. So there's really, right now, there's no end in sight. So year after year after year. And there are specific ones for MERBs or stratas. So there's provincial grants and there are federal grants. If a grant is required, or if a grant is requested, that's fine. I mean, companies like ours assist in that process of going through the government bureaucracy, but there is a very specific set of rules requiring a site auditing. Is there power available in the building? There is load calculations that have to be done, et cetera, et cetera. So, and this, again, this goes back to what Tony mentioned, is that because you want a charging station in an older building doesn't mean you're going to get one. And it might be because there's just not the facilities to supply the energy in an older building. So you need to look at, that's the starting point. And then, of course, there's the installation that needs to be considered. And of course, you need to have fully qualified people that know how to install this equipment. And in addition to that, what needs to be considered is somebody in the strata is going to have to administer or administrate this, or the EVSE, the charging station. So somebody's going to need to be able to monitor it. So that the company that you use is going to have energy management as a tool in their toolbox, so that after installation, they can then hand over the back end, for lack of a better term, to the administrator so that they can now access this thing. So how does that look? So there's a couple of pieces to that. So the owner will have typically a mobile device, so they will be able to have their own ability to monitor typically on their cell phone or whatever. And the administrator, of course, will have usually a laptop or a PC or whatever that will also be able to monitor at their end as well. So there is the ability to, once it's installed, to now offer access, and that only would come through the strata. So an owner wants to have access with their electric car, they then get registered with the administrator and they're put into the system. So anybody else that is not in the system cannot use that charging station. So there's a lockout procedure, if you like. There's a security feature. So the administrator allows that access, and at the same time, when that person logs in and charges, the administrator knows exactly who that is and how much energy is being consumed. And back again to Tony's point that there's an agreement reached. What do you get charged for this? Are you being charged per hour? Are you being charged per day, per month, whatever the case? That is something that is completely up to the strata, and in consultation, of course, with owners that have electric vehicles. So the bottom line here is that you can actually turn an electric vehicle charging station into a, it's almost a budgeted income line, if you like. It's a means of getting money into the strata. So you can, depending on, of course, on how much money that you're going to charge people for this charging.
Okay, thanks, Rob. So yeah, step one, planning. As we know, proper planning prevents pretty poor performance. There's a lot of things you want to consider. Rob touched on some of those. You want to look at what existing building infrastructure you currently have, and how that can be repurposed. The configuration, the costs, that's all really dependent on what you can work with. Even older buildings, sometimes with aluminum wiring can be modified to function well with EV charging, although the output is really going to depend on what you've got. So what the gauge of the wire is, how much of it there is, where we can tap off. But you want to make sure, I think, when you are going through that infrastructure assessment process, that you're working with people who are familiar with the needs of EV charging. Just because the requirements for EV charging are substantially different than what you're going to see in a lot of other settings, and the technology is changing, or has changed, and is continuing to change rapidly. And you really want to make sure that you're taking that into account and future proofing, because if you go for what looks like the simplest solution, it may not be scalable, and you may kind of end up painting yourselves into a corner and running your level of costs up substantially down the road. Other things to consider, commute distances, how much are you driving? That's really going to affect, how much charging you're going to need. What the procurement timelines are for your owners. If you've got lots of owners already with EVs, obviously you want to get those charges in quickly. What those utility rates are like. As I talked about this maybe in one of the questions, demand charges factor into how much the power costs. It's generally in a large condo, not just restricted to the kilowatt hours. There's also a kilowatts element. So how much power is being drawn at that building's peak level. So that's something that you want to think about in this planning process. How you're going to allocate those costs. The equipment that you go with, is it locked to a certain network operator? So some suppliers like ChargePoint, if you put in their hardware, you better like their network, because you won't be able to switch at some point in the future. So that's something to consider as well. And then just those long-term costs. It may seem cheaper to do one or two here, but you don't want to paint yourself into a corner. Installation considerations, I think, Tony brought this up early on. You want experienced technicians that have worked with the technology. EVITP, that's the Electric Vehicle Installation Training Program, that's put forward by the Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. It's a really good program, and it's something that we would recommend any strata look out for. It just shows that the electricians that you're working with, have an idea of what's going on, and are trained in electric vehicle technology. As was talked about by both Rob and Tony, timelines. It does take time we get up to these stages, and often there are deadlines on the rebates, and so you want to kind of schedule things in order to make those sync up, so you're not running out of time to get your money back. There's always the opportunity of supply chain lags So you want to put in an order for the hardware, with enough time to not run into those deadline issues. And then, obviously making sure that your installation accounts for future needs. So, making sure that, if you're going to be electrifying everything at some point, getting the big enough conduit to run all the future wires that you're going to need through it. Energy management. This is something that probably a lot of strategists may not think about in association with EV charging, but tying back to that demand issue, most condos pay demand fees depending on what their total power consumption is. So what those demand fees are vary by rate class. Small general service, which you might see, 40 units or less, you may not have any demand fees. But if you've got usually a kind of somewhere around 40 units or so in a strata, you're usually going to be on a medium or large general service, and you can be paying on a large general service up to $12 per kilowatt. And so that means that if you're plugging in a car, at this kind of daily peak, right when everyone gets home from work, just plugging in that one car can add $70 or more to the utility bill per month, just for running for 15 minutes. And so having a network system that monitors other loads in the building and delays or throttles EV charging at those peak times can save thousands of dollars a month in those demand fees. And so I think that's something that's really important to think about, because it's not just the kilowatt hours, it's also the kilowatts, and often the kilowatts can be more expensive than the kilowatt hours. And then the other load management piece, energy management piece, is load sharing. You can get away with a smaller number of circuits, a smaller number of breakers, and less conduit if you're intelligently sharing the load between parking stalls. Cost allocation. Just things to think about. As you plan. Are you going to incorporate the cost of installation into the billing? Like, are you going to tack on an extra, say, 25 cents an hour of charging or 5 cents a kilowatt hour of charging to help pay back those infrastructure costs? Or is it all going to be done through a special levy one time? Things to consider for how you finance this. How do you account for demand charges? Do you blame the one guy who plugs in at 6 o'clock p.m. For the whole demand charge, or do you kind of spread that out evenly among all of the users? If you go with a network solution, is there a charge? Is there a fee associated with the billing service that may be managed for you? Or are there charger management fees for kind of that access control that Rob was talking about? Often, and for the most part, for most network solutions, there are those kinds of fees. So how do you account for those, and what are those upfront? Things to think about. And are you going to bill the user directly, or will a network do that for you? If the network is collecting that money, do they remit it to the strata or directly to the utility? And then who owns what, and how is that worked into the bill? So other things to keep in mind. And then the last one, network management and maintenance. So who's going to manage your system if you have a new person move into your condo? Are they going to get access by talking to the strata representative, or to the property manager, or to the third-party network? What is the arrangement for that? How will residents access? Will they use, an app? Will they just kind of plug in when they get there and hope that no one else, not their neighbors, not, taking the cord from them and billing them for it? Those kinds of things. And then, if something goes wrong, who's going to take care of that? Is that the strata's responsibility? Is it the individual's responsibility? Or do you have kind of a third-party network management company that's taking care of it automatically under warranty? So just things that are worth considering. Again, there's a lot, but if you work with a qualified and experienced contractor and network provider, they should be able to help walk through this and come up with the best solution that works, based on the objectives of your organization. So, yeah, that's all I've got, and I'll hand it back over to Tony.
Super, thanks, Neil. I do have two questions though that you guys can answer. One more, I think, important than the other, but and you kind of touched on it, Neil. But if you have a network of parking charging stations within the building, it's critical to actually manage that network so that the charging is happening at off-peak times. And that technology is now quite readily available, as well as within the charging stations themselves. If you're the Strata monitoring the consumption use, the accuracy of consumption is incredibly accurate as well. And that comes up frequently. How do we manage 5 or 10 parking spaces at the same time? And it's by charging during low hours, low demand hours. You're not paying peak rates. It's less pressure on the system, and they're in random cycles. So the system can easily be managed to manage multiple stations throughout the building system.
Yeah, they can all be set up for off-peak, as you mentioned, off-peak charging. That's very simple.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Daryl, questions for us? I only see about 100 questions now.
One that Tony, for you, I think we've had a couple of questions about charging for power, right? And I think if you could just speak to regulation 6.9 kind of.
So the regulation permits user fees that are reasonable, and it's both for two purposes. One is the consumption of the utility, whatever that may be, and this is just a user fee permitted. You're not charging for electricity, you're imposing a user fee and defining it that in that capacity. So it's not in violation of the Utilities Commission regulations. So you can do it, the user fee can either be a fixed fee, or it can be a rate per kilowatt hour, one or the other. You can also add a nominal charge for the recovery of infrastructure costs. So if the Strata Corporation wants to electrify the parking garage and it costs, let's say, $20,000 to do it, they could impose as part of the user fee for every charging station $5, $10 a month as part of the recovery cost over the long term of the electrification of the system. So there are ways of doing this and over time recovering some of those costs, if not all of them at the same time. But just remember, whatever the rate is or the fee you charged, it must be fixed in the rule or the bylaw. And then the rule or the bylaw has to be ratified at your next general meeting. A rule is perfectly fine, perfectly enforceable. In exchange for not complying with the rule, their electricity to their charging station, if they don't pay their fees, can just simply be cut off. So, it's not like they have perpetual use and you're going to fight the battle. You're just going to cut them off if they're not paying their bills. It's a nominal amount, but over time and with the accumulated number of services, the rule is a really nice way of dealing with it. And rules can be amended by majority vote. They can be ratified at any general meeting. You're not paying filing costs in land titles or having to go through a 3/4 vote for a bylaw. They're quicker, they're easier, and they're enforceable under the regulations. But I just remembered my second question too while we're at this. And my second question, and we've had this problem in my building already. We have a number of electric vehicles. We have a safety problem where the vehicles are silent and no one can hear them. And so we have a pedestrian safety problem that's arising. And I've realized that the regulation is changing, that electric vehicles now have to produce some level of noise as an alert. But it doesn't exist on a number of vehicles, and they really are silent. I think Strata Corporation should be looking at other things like speed of vehicles in parking garages, because this is an issue that is arising that we've come across.
Yeah, it's definitely an issue, because if you're in a facility with an older demographic, they could be hard of hearing as well. So it is actually a very big deal. And I belong to 2 stratas actually, and one of them, there's an aging population, And it is a huge issue. And even with a gasoline vehicle, many of them are very, very quiet as well. So speed limits now on the property of many stratas is a very big deal because of the noise, the lack of noise.
Great. So another question that we have is, so this is a scenario, 100-unit high-rise with underground parking, currently no EVs, in existence there, but may have no more than 2 to 5% of EVs in the next couple of years. So what is the least expensive way of moving ahead with EV infrastructure, allowing for the maximum flexibility over several years as technology advances and changes? And then can you also speak to the demand management? Is it important, essential, or nice to have?
Neil, I'll take the first half if you want to take the second half.
Sure. Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and I'll jump in after.
Okay. So what we suggest in most cases is to follow the government guidelines for adoption. So by 2030, 30% of new vehicles, light vehicle sales, so cars, primarily cars, but by 2030, 30% of new light duty vehicle sales has to be a ZEV, or zero emission vehicle. So another way of saying an electric car for the most part. So 2030, 30%. So we're suggesting to aim for a minimum of 30% of the parking stalls should be available or made available to be converted over to an electric vehicle charging station spot. Not to say that it's parking, it may not, because in many cases, it's prohibitive. There's just not enough parking, but at least there will be 30% of the stalls in a strata will have the infrastructure for charging. So that's the kind of the guideline that you really should be, and that's a minimum, but that's what stratas should be aiming for right now, because electric cars are not going away. And I'll turn the other question over to Neil.
Sure. On the demand management sides, is demand management necessary? Only if you don't want to spend unnecessary money. So, yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, if you're in a 100-unit building, looking to a future where you're likely to have 100 vehicles charging, or some large share of that, even if it's 50 vehicles charging, if everyone gets home at the end of the day, which is the most normal thing to do, is you get home, you pull up and you plug in your car, and then people go up and they turn on their stoves, and the building demand starts going through the roof. At the same time, you're going to be adding to your peak, and if you have 6 kilowatts per charger that add to that peak, and you have 50 chargers, you're talking about 300 kilowatts, and at $12 a kilowatt, you're talking $3,600 a month in additional electrical charges, which can be totally avoided with a demand management system that just keeps an eye on what's happening elsewhere in the building and adjusts the EV charging rates accordingly. So is it necessary? Strictly in a physical sense, in a lot of buildings, no. Is it recommended? If you want to manage the costs in a realistic way, I would say it's essential.
Super. Thank you. And so we've had a couple of questions kind of related to this power capacity study, whether it's an older building or a relatively new building within the last 15 years that just hasn't had this stuff installed in it. So maybe speak a little bit more to what's included in that, if you can provide even a ballpark rate, but also, does it include things like investigating whether the Strata Corporation itself has some deficiencies like aluminum wiring that might need to be changed, or does this include capacity related to the installation of heat pumps or other things down the road, or is it just merely about the EVCS?
So I'm going to jump in on that because we're doing 2 major buildings right now. that are having work done and that are having their capacity studies done. Both of them are through electrical contractors with electrical engineers. They're a nominal cost. They are not a significant cost. They were $3,500 to have them done. They were also a godsend to have them done. As one building discovered, they have surplus power to virtually charge 150 parking stalls. And they're going to do an LED upgrade on their buildings as well. And the other building discovered that they have virtually no surplus power whatsoever because of the age of the building itself. They had a very small load that was capable to be able to be managed, and they're going to plan for an upgrade. So the capacity study, if you're doing just one station, it's unlikely to have a significant impact. But if you're going to be looking at the next 5 years, next 10 years, and you're looking at the long term, take the time to do it. Get the approval to do the study, because it will be a resourceful piece of information for planning for upgrades as you start doing upgrades for your building. The other side of that is, don't feel like you have to grant permission to somebody immediately because they've gone out and bought an electric vehicle. Our first upgrade in our building took 18 months before we agreed to all the terms and conditions, had the electrical capacity done. We did a survey of the owners to see how many people were planning on getting stations. And then we actually planned for 10 stations on our first round. And we did our P1 level. We electrified P1 level. And that gave us a really great sense for the next 5-year plan as we move forward. So, you know, this is not an urgent situation, and people certainly want to buy electric vehicles. They're great for buildings. They don't produce pollution within our living spaces, which is a really nice thing. But take the time that's necessary to do this right, so that you don't have to be going back and say, geez, I wish we had on the following conditions. It saves a lot to get your study done, to have that piece of information to go forward.
Great. And that capacity upgrade or power study itself, is it something that if there's infrastructure requirements, like through BC Hydro upgrades to something, is it the Strata Corporation that pays, or is it the individual, or is it the utility?
The utility doesn't pay for it. It's going to be paid by the Strata Corporation, because it'll be an upgrade to the common property, the common services, the common utility. The Strata Corporation could require that some of those costs as a condition of approval be covered. They could require that, or they could build some of those costs into the rates that they charge with respects to the recovery of electricity. You know, the rate per kilowatt is as follows in the rule, and to recover the cost of the electrical capacity study and the work that was done to electrify the building, there's a surcharge of $5 or $10 or $25 per month per space. And this is how the Strata Corporation can make this feasible. It doesn't, you know, the one challenge we have right now is, if you take a 3/4 vote of your 100-unit strata to your owners to permit charging stations, odds are it's not going to pass, because the 99% of the people who are not interested in electric vehicles yet think they're going to have to pay for all the costs. If you plan this out well and plan for a future rollout of it and recovery of costs, they won't be doing that. It'll be a user-pays system, and the owners will be much more willing to support the upgrade, which is good for the building as well.
Great. And so, question for Neil and Rob here, I believe. So with technology changes by 2035, should older stratas take a wait and see approach of how technology will change, and whether that's vehicle batteries or charging stations, or is that a reality?
Well, I would say on the vehicle technology, I mean, you know, everyone has their own kind of take on it, and you know, it depends a lot on how old and how worn your current vehicle is. In terms of the economics of owning if you're going to buy a new car right now and drive it until its normal end of life, you will spend less money over the lifetime of the vehicle buying an electric car right now than a gasoline car. You can buy a Volkswagen ID4 for $45,000. And over the lifetime of the car, it will cost you less to operate than a base model Honda Civic that costs you $24,000, just because we have expensive gasoline and cheap electricity in British Columbia. So if you're looking at replacing a car now, buying an EV already makes sense economically. But you know, if you got more life left in your car that you have right now, there's no reason not to, you know, use it till its normal end of life. And you know, if you wait down the road, the cost of the cars will come down. With respect to the charging, the cost of the charging is not likely to come down substantially anymore. We've really seen a bit of a plateauing in the cost of the charging infrastructure in terms of the hardware itself, largely because most of the cost is in copper and labor for putting EV charging in. And labor, you know, it grows with inflation. Copper is a commodity. It goes up and it goes down, but it doesn't really drop much more than it already has. We've got the process for extracting copper pretty dialed by this point in history. What we're likely to see in EV charging is software that makes it better over time. But as long as the hardware that you get, so the charging station, is an open source protocol, you'll be able to push new software on it continuously that continues to evolve and gain capacity over time as the software advances. So you'll be able to have these over-the-air updates. And so in terms of that, as long as you could get, you know, an open protocol level 2 charger, it will be able to meet those future needs.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Daryl. I'm just going through some of the questions here, and I've found a really good one, actually.
Go for it.
Once an EVSE is installed, does it become property of the Strata? Great question. Depends on how that infrastructure was installed. So did Strata pay for it? Then yes, Strata owns it, typically. But if it's a one-off and an owner asked for permission, received permission, put in the rules, et cetera, all the protocols followed, the charging station itself would have been probably purchased by the owner of the electric vehicle. That person owns that charging station. However, if that owner moves, the infrastructure will stay, and it would become part of the walls. So if there's conduit run, and as Neil mentioned, running copper, all of that would stay with the building. The person would probably unhook the charging station off the wall, the charger itself, and take that with them. So in many cases, or many instances, we're finding that people will, if they're asking for permission in a Strata for charging, that what they'll end up by receiving is a plug. So you get a wall plug. So say a NEMA 1450 wall plug, and they'll buy a charging station with a plug on the end of it, as opposed to hard wiring the charging station into the infrastructure. Then the person just simply unplugs the charging station and takes it with them, and that because they paid for that. Highly unlikely that the owner is going to want to tear out all and pay for the removal of all of the infrastructure once it's already put in place. But again, that piece becomes a negotiable item. But most of the time, it just stays with the building. So that's a great question.
So I just want to add one layer to that. There is no interpretation or definition of that. You must define who owns the station and the infrastructure in the user agreement before you grant permission.
Right.
That's the only way to determine how that asset is actually established. So it's you're absolutely right, Rob, that these conditions exist, but you have to set the definition itself and within the agreement of the user agreement for the installation, if it's not the Strata Corporation installing the stations. So if it's an owner, you just go back to it, make sure that you actually define it clearly.
Right.
Yeah. Daryl, we're way past time.
Yep.
So, and people are starting to leave off here, so I don't want anybody left out. So a copy of this presentation is going to be made available to everyone. Donna will get it sent out. Again, you can use the info@CHOA for more questions if you have more questions. And I'm going to go right back up to the very top. And here we have our email addresses, both for Rob and myself, if you have additional questions. And we're looking at all the new sourcing for funding. And as we get all of that posted, we'll get that up as well on the website for users to have access. Rob and Neil, thanks so much. It was great to have you join us. That was very helpful and useful information. And everyone who joined us today, thanks so much. It was great to have you on board. And we'll look forward to seeing you at our next session.
Cool. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.